right, what's up, everybody? We've got a very cool episode of Wildlife Cake and Cocktails coming at you tonight. We're talking Status of Conservation and Decline of Amphibians, a new book from CSIRO Publishing by Dr. Jodi Rowley and Harold Heatwole. In honor of our special amphibian guests, I'm sipping a juicy frog. That's half a shot of vodka, half a shot of triple sec, half a shot of sour mix, a dash of lime cordial, all on ice, topped with lemonade. And I've also got a massive slice of very green velvet cake. So I am ready to go. Now, joining us on the show, our returning guest, you've met her before on previous shows, Dr. Jodi Rowley. After a Bachelor of Environmental Science in Biology at the Uni of New South Wales in 2002 and a PhD at JCU in 2007, followed by a wide variety of research, lecturing and museum roles, Jodi became the Curator of Amphibian and Reptile Conservation Biology at the Australian Museum in 2016. Jodi's a biologist with a focus on Australasian amphibian biodiversity, ecology and conservation, using a broad integrative approach. She's also involved in the massive FrogID free citizen science smartphone app, which you can download and use to record, identify and map frog calls all around Australia. And on top of all that, she's got a new book out from CSIRO Publishing. That's Status of Conservation and Decline of Amphibians, Australia, New Zealand and Pacific Islands, edited by Harold Heatwole and Jodi Rowley. Jodi, thanks so much for joining us again. Great to have you back on the show to talk all things froggy.
Thank you for having me.
No worries. How have you been? Obviously very busy with the book and with FrogID at the moment, I imagine.
Yeah, well, the book is keeping me less busy now. It was a bit of a crazy end of the year last year when we were trying to get the book sort of in the final stages and also launching FrogID as well. But now FrogID is still keeping us busy, but the book, it's just lovely to finally be out.
Well, look, I'm so happy to have my hands on it. I've got it right here. I've been smashing through it as much as possible. And yeah, look, we're obviously going to get into this a little bit more. But first of all, it's just a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful cover with some amazing photos by Stephen Mahoney, a herpetologist here in Australia, and a lot of other really amazing frog biologists and herpetologists. So, well, first of all, it looks amazing. And, secondly, it's just fantastic, very broad coverage of a lot of these conservation issues in amphibians. So we'll definitely be talking more about that. But for now, I guess let's talk a bit about FrogID. Obviously, what is about 4 months now, and we follow you guys on Twitter. We see you guys on social media. What is it, over 4 months now? It's like close to 22,000 calls or so that you guys have mapped so far.
Yeah, it's been absolutely amazing. So it's actually even, I don't know if it feels longer or shorter than actually since it was launched, but it was November the 10th last year. So we're now over 6 months. We've had 22,000 and as of right now, 22,108 recordings submitted, and there's almost 27,000 verified frog records off that, because there's often more than one species calling at once, and 159 out of Australia's 241 species, unfortunately 240 native and one introduced species, the cane toad. So the amount of data that we've been able to collect so far is more than I could even consider doing in 10 lifetimes. If I went around Australia with my recording equipment, there's no way on earth, 300 Jodis would have been able to collect this much data. So it's incredibly humbling how much people have got on board and it's incredibly exciting how much data we have. I mean, one of the biggest obstacles facing frog conservation in Australia and around the world as well was our lack of knowledge. So this is just proven that people care about frogs and that we can gather the data that we need to hopefully help save our awesome frogs.
Right. And look, as you mentioned, with the lack of data in frogs, I guess that you guys have from our our last conversations, you guys had already mapped some range extensions. Frogs being found calling in areas where they haven't necessarily been found before outside of their known distribution. So already getting some pretty amazing data right there, and that was several months back now. So is there anything in particular that's popping up in the data that you guys are finding particularly interesting?
Well, we're actually just getting a chance to really get into the data and really analyse the data because we've been so busy listening to the frog calls. But there's a huge number of range extensions, of records of frogs calling in months of the year that nobody knew that those frogs would call. It seems like a lot of, particularly the frogs in drier areas, even though they might have a usual breeding season, if it does rain outside of that breeding season, they will just give it a go anyway. And tons of range extensions. So, maybe it's 6 kilometre range extension in this species, 20, 25 in another. In some species, it's more than 100 kilometres from where they've ever been recorded before. And they seem like relatively little things we're pretty excited every time we get them. But together, it's just the ability to understand frogs at a scale that's never been before possible, and really even understand basic things like distributions, which we haven't been able to. And so now we're starting to get into having a look at possible movements and changes over time. We're looking at how frogs are responding to different weather events, and we're also looking at how a frog species calls changes over space, and whether that might represent or help us discover new species within species that we at the moment consider one.
Yeah, wow. That's super cool. Look, I definitely want to come back to the weather thing as well, but I found it super interesting. You were saying that you've got some of them found calling outside of season. Like that's totally one of those things that you're only going to have with a citizen science program of landholders and people who actually live out in these areas, because you can't organize that many field trips to cover every single location in every single season. Meanwhile, if somebody happens to have the app and live in an area and they have a little bit of rainfall, they might off chance catch some of these behaviors that aren't so well known, to some of these breeding behaviors and calling behaviors.
Exactly. That's exactly it. I mean, you've got to be Johnny on the spot when it comes to frogs in Australia throughout most of the arid and semi-arid areas. I can plan a trip all I want somewhere to find a frog, but if I get there and it's not rained enough, or alternatively, if I plan the trip and as soon as it rains I go out there, it's possibly dried out already. There was times where it's been raining in Alice Springs or raining in some important parts of Australia where the frogs are rarely out and calling, and I'll realise because someone's recorded a frog and then try and get more people to get out there, record the frogs. But by the time I do that, they've already gone back down again underground. So that is one of the most amazing things. And the other thing is also just access. So as a scientist, you can sort of go down the roads and listen for frogs, but you can't sort of get into a lot of these places, unless you're invited in. So having landowners surveying, even in what are not particularly remote areas, it's just a whole lot of private property. Even in the suburbs of Perth, you wouldn't know where these frogs are, but it's this amazing snapshot of urban frog diversity because people are recording frogs in their backyards.
Yeah, absolutely. As far as the arid zone, I remember, seeing the Cyclorana albigittata, some of the burrowing frogs out there, and once there's a little bit of rain, those clay pans just fill up with them. And on top of that, there's areas that look like absolute plain grassland, but if a little bit of that surface gets excavated, well, all of a sudden you're finding huge amounts of frogs. They're in areas where you just would not expect them to be. They're just burrowed into these rather arid, rather scrubby areas, and you would have absolutely no idea that they were there.
Yeah, exactly. You don't know how abundant frogs are, particularly in the arid and semi-arid areas, until you go during a flood or even just sort of a first rain event for a very long time. And then you'll realise just how important frogs are, how abundant they should be, and therefore how important they are in healthy ecosystems as well.
Yeah, cool. And, a huge part of everything's diet as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, frogs eat tons of insects, many of which are pest species, and they're also eaten by a huge amount of animals, mammals, birds, reptiles, and so they do support a very healthy ecosystem, but it is incredibly hard to study them during these periods of boom and bust, and when they're above the ground calling. That's when the roads all of a sudden become impassable, and so it makes it very difficult for someone like myself to get into these places when it's flooding, and so that's why it's so absolutely amazing whenever we get these brief periods of rain when people submit calls from wherever they are, because they're stuck there potentially, and we're really, really glad that they're recording the calls of the frogs that might only come up once a year or once every couple of years.
Yeah, right. That red sand and that bull dust gets a little bit hard to pass once the the wet season starts to settle in. Well, look, let's talk about some of that. Actually, there has been some interesting weather already this year. So obviously this is going to be very interesting for a lot of you frog people, and I imagine for anybody out there with FrogID, there's probably been some pretty cool opportunities. For example, in May, central Queensland had huge amounts of rainfall, which ended up flooding all the way through Channel Country. So that's all the way through where Queensland basically connects to South Australia around the Lake Eyre Basin. And the Lake Eyre Basin and Lake Eyre filled up some 2 months later. I think there's still people, putting yachts on Lake Eyre at the moment. So on top of that as well, some massive rainfalls in Perth and southern WA in early June. Did you guys get a huge pouring in of frogs whenever these rain events happen?
We do, and we really hope for it as well. I get so excited looking at the rainfall radars in Australia and seeing particularly when it's raining in a place that we haven't got a lot of calls from or that's particularly important for frogs. So we certainly got a lot of calls from Western Queensland during those initial rains, which was really exciting. Some of the burrowing frogs, the cycloranas and things that we haven't got many recordings of them, and some of them that sound really quite different to their sort of relatives or in other states and other areas that we have recordings from. And Western Australia, and particularly Perth, around Perth, has been just going off for the last couple of months. It's been where we've been getting the most exciting frog calls as the sort of breeding season, a lot of WA's southwest frogs has kicked off. And so we've got a lot of records of some absolutely amazing frogs from there. And a lot of repeat recordings, which is so incredibly important. So a lot of people kind of think, oh, you've already got our striped marsh frog calling in our backyard. We won't record it for FrogID again. But what we want it to do is understand how frogs respond to weather, and in a long term, how they're responding to a changing climate, how they're responding to a changing environment. So we really do want these repeat recordings over time. We want your striped marsh frog or your green tree frog or your moaning frog calling every night if possible. And so a lot of people in Perth in particular have been absolutely amazing, and over the last few months submitting a frog call every night or every couple of nights or every weekend, which is amazing.
That's awesome. That's obviously super important. I mean, it's nice to get a record of an occurrence, but without repeat data, you're really not going to know much about any sort of the ecological things. You're not going to have any other data points to try to even begin to correlate other variables like weather or seasonality or even location to some extent. You're not really going to have much data there to work with at all.
Yeah, it's a bit of a scale thing. So if everyone just records a frog once sort of in the Sydney area, because there's a lot of people around here, then we'll be able to understand things a bit. But it's ideal to get these repeat recordings so that we are able to correlate what's happening with the environment, how frogs are responding to rain, temperature, droughts, and we can look at that over time and see if potentially frogs are breeding earlier in Australia. It's been demonstrated in other countries that frogs are starting to breed earlier and earlier each year due to a warming climate, but is that going to happen in Australia? Frogs in Australia have adapted to be so in tune with an environment that can be incredibly unpredictable. So how will they respond as things start to change up? We really don't know. So this is the first, it's a major opportunity to be getting long-term data, and long-term as in sort of, once a week, once every night, getting the backyard frogs, but also hopefully for many years and look at trends over time.
Yeah, that's awesome. And, obviously, especially as we're talking with our arid zone frogs, they're super reliant on those rainfalls. And if, they're going to be disrupted by future climate change, going to be some challenges for those frogs in the future.
Yeah, definitely. And even just potentially getting the baseline data that we don't really have for frogs of Australia. So getting a really good idea of how things are now, and then we can compare it into the future as well. Because we've got very patchy records of frogs over the last 200 years in Australia, really patchy sort of distribution records. And so what FrogID is doing is putting records of frogs on the map that are geo-referenced, that are time-stamped, that are identified by experts. And so hopefully we'll be able to then much more easily understand how our frogs are doing and how they're changing over time.
Yeah, cool. Look, I'm personally, as just from watching you guys, I didn't really consider Perth or southwest to like be an amazing frog area until obviously learning a bit more about these guys and seeing all the amazing frogs that started popping up on your guys' feed when the rain started hitting that area, such as the humming frog, which is just incredible. And I believe that's the one on your cover, Neobatrachus plebatoides.
Pelobatoides. Yeah, so a lot of the Neobatrachus, a lot of the burrowing frogs, we tried to get represented in the book, because so often in Australian frog paraphernalia, you'll get your good old green tree frog and one of your other sort of showy, pretty tree frogs, which I love. But we really wanted to try and get some of the more underrepresented frogs of Australia, show the diversity, and make people realise, there's been a hashtag going around Twitter for a while of round frogs. And it's one of my most favourite sort of hashtags to follow a lot of people. We've got some amazing round frogs in Australia, and there are some amazing round frogs in other countries too, but these are the burrowing frogs in general. These are the frogs that are adapted to the drier conditions, and they have to be round and usually have relatively short limbs so that they can survive underground without losing too much water. But they are some of my favourite frogs, so I'm really glad. I mean, Stephen Marnie provided some amazing photographs. He works at the Australian Museum with me and is amazing reptile and frog guru. And so it was wonderful to have his photo on the cover of the book. It's definitely makes it look extra special. Yeah, look, it's an amazing shot. And we generally do think of frogs as being like kind of greenish in colour, thus our green drink and our green cake. We're having a juicy frog and a green velvet cake at the moment, by the way, just to keep the froggy theme. But this thing is actually like yellow and black leopard spotted with some amazing sort of speckling and patterning, and then this kind of as you said, much shorter limbed, obviously a little burrowing frog. So are these one of the myobatrachid frogs? Yeah, they are. So yeah, we've got ground frogs, which fall into the family Myobatrachidae, and they're the sort of I guess mostly the kind of lesser known frogs, except for your old striped marsh frog along the east coast of Australia is pretty well known. It sort of sounds like a tennis ball being hit, and so that's a frequent backyard frog. But we do also, some of our round frogs are actually tree frogs. So we've got frogs that have come from these showy green frogs and actually have been adapted or adapted themselves, become adapted to living underground as well. So the water holding frogs actually aren't true ground frogs in terms of their evolutionary relationship. They're actually tree frogs that have gone underground. So we have some amazing frogs in Australia. We don't have the most species of frog, in the world. We've got only 240 native frog species at the moment anyway. It doesn't quite compete to countries like Brazil and Colombia, but we have some amazing frogs with some amazing adaptations. Yeah, right. So the roundness in both the Myobatrachids and the tree frogs, so I'm guessing the Hylidae or the Pelodryadidae, I think. Yep. So that's convergent evolution in those in the burrowing Pelodryadidae frogs. Yeah, and in other countries, other families have also adapted to the same thing. You just lose far too much water if you're nice and leggy. You've got to be nice and round and be able to hold your water if you're going to survive underground for, up to a year or more. Right, and obviously the same thing with temperature for a lot of animals with the scaling law. Well, obviously anything with a larger surface area is going to. A larger surface area to volume ratio is going to lose heat and obviously, I guess, moisture across that permeable surface faster. Yeah, we do have a lot of small round frogs as well, like the Euparolia, and they do tend to survive quite well as well. But some frogs also have other adaptations. So tree frogs are able to survive. So like your green tree frog or your red tree frog are able to survive by secreting kind of fats onto their skin, which acts as a bit of a waterproofer. And so there are definitely frogs such as these which are as waterproof as reptiles even as well. So you think of frogs as losing water like crazy, but they actually have quite a few adaptations. And then, of course, there are the cycloranas, some of the water-holding frogs that are quite round and do burrow underground, but they also form cocoons. So they take that to the next level and kind of secrete enough stuff on their skin to end up protecting them quite well from losing water underground.
Right. So there's those cycloranas and those water-holding, specifically the water-holding burrowing frogs. They do they exude a lot of other stuff other than just layers and layers of shed skin, or is there some other kind of chemistry going on there?
Yeah, other kind of chemistry. So most frogs, they secrete a whole lot of different things, some of which we might not know the functions, but certainly are being used for use in human medicine, like antivirals, anti-cancer, antibacterial, antifungal. All sorts of chemicals are on frog skin, partially because they're essentially like sort of agar plates in wet places usually, so they're likely to get infected unless they have some kind of protection on their skin. But in this case, they use these fats and other chemicals to actually make a bit of a watertight seal, which is pretty fantastic.
Yeah, awesome. Well, very cool stuff. I guess with all the rain that we've been having recently, it's getting into the dry season for a lot of those areas, but we did still have some rain in the Pilbara region and that kind of stuff. Is there any areas in particular you're waiting to get rainfall? You're right in that it's dried out a lot of northern Australia. We're getting some fantastic calls from North Queensland, from the top end and from the Kimberley, and they have pretty much stopped. We did recently have rains from the Pilbara, and we would love more rains there so we could get more calls from there. But we're excited to get calls from everywhere, and we've had a very wet couple of weeks in New South Wales recently, in Sydney in particular. So there's been a lot of the winter breeding frogs out and about. I mean, most people, particularly on the East Coast, I think, it's winter. There's not going to be that many frogs out, possibly because it's not many humans out at night because it's freezing and raining. But there are winter breeding frogs out there now, and we're getting a lot of submissions of the winter breeding frogs, which is pretty awesome, particularly the common eastern froglet, which, as its name implies, is quite common. But it is really, really great to get any recordings, and these are the kind of things, these abundant species are probably going to help us a lot more in understanding how frogs are responding to climate change, because we're getting such a great number of calls. So we definitely do not, we get excited with every frog call that we receive. We're not incredible snobs and only get excited about the rare ones. It's like, send me something interesting already.
Oh, yeah, no, we do love them all. We do get a few crickets, we do get a few birds, but yeah, we don't, we love everything that we get, and we're really appreciative that people are taking the time to record frogs. But I mean, we do get a little bit extra excited when we get, for example, a frog that hasn't been submitted to FrogID yet, which happens on quite a regular basis.
Yeah, cool. Well, when's the last time you guys had a species added to your FrogID checklist?
Actually, it was about a week ago when we got Sloanes Frog, which is a threatened frog species from New South Wales and Victoria. It's just started up their breeding season, and so we're getting submissions of these guys. And actually, the community groups and OEH are actually doing Sloanes Frog surveys using FrogID as well, which is really fantastic. And that's one of the other things that we're really keen to get, is to people to sort of use FrogID as a tool. So whatever your surveys that you're doing out there, whether you're doing general surveys, whether you want to do specific frog surveys, whether you just want to know what's in your local park, that you sort of get into it, record the frogs, and then find out for yourself what, then have experts identifying the frog calls for you, which makes it a lot easier for you.
Well, I mean, the really cool thing is, that it's, I guess, still in early development. So even though there may be a few less frogs calling at this time of year, anybody who's jumping on now is still going to be the first to get those winter calling frogs. Yeah,
definitely. And there's a lot of frogs, particularly in the arid area. And also in Cape York, that we still have to get. So there's definitely lots of time for people to be firsts.
Nice one. All right, so arid zone in Cape York, is it? That's where we need some people to start jumping on.
Yeah, but we still have even some frogs in Tassie that we haven't got as well. So given that we're not even we're almost at 160 frogs submitted to FrogID, and there's 240 native species, we've got some ways to go. Of course, a few of these actually don't have calls that are known. So these are going to be the really interesting ones. So no one's ever recorded the calls of some of these frogs. And so when we hear something that is not like any other frog we've heard, that's when we're going to get extra excited.
And like jump in a helicopter or a plane and go looking for it.
You're not too far from the truth. We have heard a few quite interesting noises that we're keen to get people to submit more calls from that area from, and potentially even get up and do an expedition in search of these frogs, because there's some very strange sounding frogs out there that just might be something new, and that's what we're hoping for.
Fingers crossed. Some new species found by FrogID, some, on top of all the other cool stuff that you guys have found, and I'm sure you will continue to find as that ecological long-term data kind of starts to build up. It'll be pretty cool.
Yeah, we're really excited.
All right, awesome. So, all right, that's Arid Zone and Cape York, but also everywhere else, Tasmania, mainland, Victoria, Queensland, WA, South Australia. Get involved, guys. frogid.net.au. It's a free app. Download it to your smartphone. What else do people need to know, Jodi?
That's pretty much it. You can check out the website. You can see the statistics. We're working on improving the visualization and making it more what you want to find from it. So please do let us know. But basically it is just download the app, press record for at least 20 seconds and then submit it, and we'll let you know what your local frogs are, and you'll be helping frog conservation in Australia. Absolutely. And of course, jump online as well to the Australian Museum, and you can get the app through there as well, I believe. Follow FrogID and at FrogID Oz AUS on Twitter, and check them out on Facebook as well. I think that about sums it up for FrogID at the moment. Is there anything else you want to mention about the FrogID before we jump onto this awesome book? No, I think just join up, be part of the community. Facebook in particular is really active, so you'll get to meet lots of people that are also using FrogID and stay up to date with the latest. That's and just download and submit, even if it's the same striped marsh frog every night. We want it. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, like you said, froggers are fun people. They're cool people to go frogging with. They enjoy frogging and they enjoy frogs. So they get really excited when they hear frogs and they see frogs, and it kind of is very infectious. Well, look, let's move on to this awesome thing that I'm holding here. Status of Conservation and Decline of Amphibians, Australia, New Zealand, and Pacific Islands. So, first of all, awesome job to everybody, obviously Harold Heatwole and yourself as the editors, all the other amazing authors, and CSIRO Publishing, everybody else involved. Firstly, this is not a field guide. I guess that's the first important point. No, it's definitely not a field guide. Not only is it relatively large, but FrogID is your best up-to-date field guide, which not just a bit of a tool, but this book is definitely not a field guide. It's much more than that. Yeah, right. So this is one of many in the long-running amphibian biology series, volume 1 of which was released in 1994 by Harold Heatwole. And this is volume 11, devoted to causes of amphibian decline and conservation. And the part 6 of this is which is what this book that I'm holding is from Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands. So there's chapters on biogeography, threats to frog populations and different species, conservation priorities, legislation, and all the various stuff covered throughout the tropics, the northern savannas, the temperate zones, the arid zone, coastal areas, and a lot more, including cane toads as well. A fantastic chapter in there on cane toads by Rick Shine. So, yeah, awesome. So I understand the aims here are pretty much, first of all, to help understand some of these complex causes of amphibian decline, and then to stimulate some research into some possible conservation solutions.
Yeah, definitely. So I was very fortunate that Harold Heatwole, who has written and edited so much, invited me to be part of this series and co-edit this book with him. And it's all about getting together the experts that are working in Australia, New Zealand and Pacific Islands on frogs and try and understand the situation, a bit of a time capsule, if you will, of where things are at. We've known about global amphibian declines, and we've been experiencing that in Australia and New Zealand in particular for a long time. And there are publications coming out all the time, scientific publications, but nothing that kind of summarizes what's going on in this part of the world as a bit of a snapshot and also a way forward. So Australia is a very big country, so we ended up splitting that up into biogeographic areas and having experts working in those regions on the frogs take lead on those chapters, and then also having some threat chapters per se in terms of cane toads, also captive breeding, ex situ conservation, and then covering Pacific Islands and New Zealand really comprehensively as well. So it was an absolute pleasure working with so many experts, also quite a challenge sometimes. I think they really got sick of my emails and Hal's email, trying to get things done. But everyone was absolutely amazing. And it was, an honour working with Hal and an honour working with absolutely everyone that was involved in this book that has now just been published. And I'm incredibly excited that it is.
Yeah, so amazing. I mean, like the author list is massive, but there's just some amazing chapter authors in here. People like Professor Rick Shine on cane toads, Professor Ben Bell on the frogs in New Zealand, the Curator Emeritus of the Smithsonian up until 2007, George Zug on the Pacific Island frogs, and that overview by Hal Cogger, who's just a legend in the Australian and global herpetological community, and book's also dedicated to him. There's a nice happy picture of him on the inside cover.
Yeah, it was working with basically a whole bunch of my heroes was fantastic, and all these people that I've been looking up to, some of them for years, some of them for decades, and someone like Hal Cogger, who has been a massive inspiration to me and also a mentor in my role at the Australian Museum. So it was a fantastic experience to try and get everyone together, and the fact that they were willing to do this. Obviously, Hal Heatwole has been doing this for a while, so I think he was the one that managed to convince everyone this was going to be a thing and that we would end up getting this book. And getting CSIRO Publishing on board was really fantastic too, because they produced such an amazing book.
Well, look, I imagine it must have been important to get CSIRO on board because as far as logistical challenges, the amount of authors and the amount of subjects, as you mentioned, there's so many different biogeographic zones of Australia that have been covered in this book, and there's a lot there to cover. It must have been a bit of a logistical nightmare.
Thank God for email. So there's no way to be able to wrangle everyone together. We've been talking about getting people together and celebrate, but people are scattered across the entire globe, not only across Australia but also in the US, New Zealand. There's a lot of people from a lot of places, but they got we had regular email exchanges. So pretty much everything was done remotely. And Hal Heatwole also lives usually half a year in Australia and half a year in the US. So spent a lot of the time that we were doing this book, we would be occasionally Skyping, but mostly just emailing him. He works at sort of strange times, ends up sort of being up in the middle of the night in the US, sometimes working on Australian time when he's even over there as well, though. So that was sort of quite fortunate that we could all kind of eventually get on into communicating. I don't know what we would have done before so much emails and Skype and things like that.
Yeah, wow. So going intercontinental to get the book done. I mean, you got to do what you got to do.
Yes, but I'm very glad that we had the technology that we did to get this together.
Yeah, cool, awesome. And look, let's start talking about the book here now. Obviously, as we mentioned, Australia, big area, so much to cover. And if you are going to start talking about frogs in Australia, they have actually been here for quite a long time. So we actually have to kind of go back to the Gondwanan origin of Australia, and when it started sort of moving northward towards Papua New Guinea and had some faunal exchange with the lands to the north of us. So I understand there's 16 species that may have moved from Australia to Papua New Guinea, I believe. But that's a lot. That's like I said, it is a very, very broad book. It covers even that whole geological timescale, especially in that sort of first chapter with the demographic overview of Australia's native amphibians.
Yeah, so Hal Cogger put that together, which was fantastic, and it is kind of an overview of the families, overview of range sizes, and species and threatened species, which sort of puts things in context. And it was great having him on board to be able to do that. And we are increasingly understanding that Australia's frogs, even in the last couple of years, we're discovering that some of our frogs are more related to frogs in New Guinea than we previously thought. With the discovery of the Cape York graceful tree frog a couple of years ago, we actually realised that sort of had been masquerading as the graceful tree frog. We just thought that was one species all on the east coast. And it wasn't until we looked at genetics in particular that realised that it was more related to its relatives in New Guinea than it was to its more southern relative as well. So we're still, even though we've been working on the frogs of Australia for a long time, and in comparison for other countries, we think we've got a pretty good idea of what's going on, we're actually still learning things every single week, month, year. And so this is, even in the next couple of months, we'll probably discover new things as well that tie us to New Guinea and help us understand our evolutionary history of our frogs.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's definitely known very, very much in reptiles. The coastal taipans that we have here are exactly the same species as the coastal taipans or the Papua New Guinea taipans that are over on the other side, over the Torres Straits. Whereas, there are some things, the death adders, which have definitely gone over at different times, the black snakes, which have actually had, species level time differences and reproductive isolation since when they went over, but some of them are much more recent. So, the stories it's a bit of a mind bender to untangle which species did what and which ones moved where when.
Yeah, certainly.
And again, as you mentioned, always new stuff changing. Like I think we spoke about this on the show recently. That it was only 2016 or so that the Geolman paper came out, and the Australian tree frogs, which were all considered members of the family Hylidae, were recently assigned to the resurrected family of Pelodryadidae. And that was only, 2 years ago?
Yeah, about that. And then the taxonomy of Australian tree frogs in particular, but more broadly, all of Australian frogs is undergoing a bit of a state of flux. We're still learning things. We're still discovering evolutionary relationships. That was actually one of the, decisions that we had to make in this book, as well as what we call Australia's tree frogs in terms of the genus. So for a long time, they have all been Latoria. There has been, in the last couple of years, revisions that proposed calling them a whole bunch of different things as well as Latoria. So only some species would actually be Latoria and others would not. Some people don't agree with Cyclorana, other people do. So we had to make some decisions, and that we would stick with Latoria for the moment because we're waiting on a really, solid revision that hopefully will be coming out soon of Australian tree frogs. So that's one of the challenges with working with a book, in deciding what taxonomy you will use, what names you will be using for the frogs. And so we made that decision so that hopefully people will be able to know people tend to know what a Latoria is as well. And so if we use the names that are going at the moment, they might not stick around. So we wanted our book to sort of have a long-term relevance and be a lot more understandable to people in the future as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, it is well phrased and well written in there. The part that I was reading, basically the book is like any book is. It's not going to be current. It's pretty much going to be somewhat out of date as soon as it's published, because it is a snapshot of what's going on. But that doesn't mean that the information in there isn't current and doesn't tie into everything that's currently going on. And there's there's so much in here. I'm still racking my brain over it, but there's it is like any natural history book, it is a snapshot of our best knowledge at the time of what's going on.
Yeah, and it's a lot of previously unpublished data as well, and stuff that might not you sort of get published in any other way. So, it's a lot of expert opinion, a lot of thoughts on what the future directions are. Some of these things wouldn't end up being, and, they're not published anywhere else but in this book. And it's definitely true that things, maybe, this year there might be a new species of frog described in Australia, and that won't be covered in this book. That will be in FrogID app though. So, we'll be updating that, and then that kind of thing will maintain as up to date as possible. But the book is something that can be used and referred to. It's a reference to how things are now and to the state of play in frog conservation in Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific. And that's sort of not anywhere else, particularly not in something that you can read all at once, although that might take a considerable amount of time. If you were to read the whole book at once, trust me, I did it quite a lot of times.
It took me a day or two, but, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed myself with it. It took my time. I suppose, we should, just talk about some of the conservation issues then while we've got this book here in front of us. Anytime we talk about amphibians, we end up coming to chytrid fungus and Batrachochytrium. I think I'm starting to get that right now. But, obviously, I think, and I believe it's mentioned in the book, there's more and more evidence of a Southeast Asian origin or an East Asian origin for chytrid fungus. So that's also something that's kind of, at the moment, is a very interesting and kind of current topic in frog conservation is, these recent papers that have come out showing that chytrid is quite likely from Eastern Asia.
Yeah, we've been, I guess, suspecting that for a while. When the amphibian chytrid fungus was first discovered in the 90s, in the late 90s, we realised that was probably responsible for a lot of these mysterious declines of frog populations around the world, including in particular Eastern Australia. We didn't know where it was coming from at that time. Was it something that was native and had something had just switched and it was impacting our frogs? Was it something that was introduced from elsewhere? Initially, it was proposed that the amphibian chytrid fungus was introduced from South Africa because of some of the frogs from South Africa, the African clawed frogs, were used in pregnancy tests and transported around the world. So when women thought that they were pregnant, the doctors would take a sample of their urine and then they would essentially drop it into where these frogs were swimming. They're aquatic frogs, and the response of the frogs, whether they ovulated or not, whether they released eggs, would tell them whether or not the female woman was pregnant or not. So we thought for a while that it was out of South Africa. And then increasingly evidence has been pointing maybe towards Asia. Some of the oldest records of infection of frogs has been out of China, Japan. And then more recently, there's been, it's taken a while, but thankfully there's now pretty conclusive evidence that certainly it is out of East Asia. So yet another thing that has been introduced into Australia and many other parts of the world that has impacting our native wildlife. So, moving things around the world is definitely not such a great idea, and it does have big implications for our biodiversity conservation.
Yeah, that was really interesting. I think it was Hanlon et al. 2018 with the East Asian origin of the chytrid fungus. I think they did. I did read this before. It was like huge amounts of whole genome sequencing for Batrachochytrium isolates. I think they had over they collected 170 something and compiled those with some online data that there was, mapped it all up against a reference genome, and had a massive database of single nucleotide polymorphisms. And from there, they found that the ones in Asia were hyperdiverse and appeared to share the most haplotypes with all of the other populations, and also had like really flat, sort of selective signatures. So the Tajima's D statistic, which if you have a lot of fluctuation in a population, either you've had contractions or massive amounts of selection, you should see that fluctuate away from zero, but they had a fairly sort of flat D statistic in their population genetics. So that's kind of indicative of an endemic population. And Yeah, very interesting stuff, and just out this year.
It's amazing how little we know about a disease that has been relatively so well studied. There are a lot of other diseases out there, though, that we're only just starting to understand. Hopefully none of them will be as devastating as the amphibian chytrid fungus has. Of course, there is the salamander chytrid fungus as well, which was only discovered several years ago as well. And that also seems to have an out of Asia origin as well.
Yeah, right. And I understand in the Hanlon paper they did some molecular dating. So, if there is a certain amount of molecular divergence and you can have an accurate molecular clock, then all you got to do is divide the number of the amount of difference by the rate of difference, and then you kind of get an age for that divergence. And they're thinking it was probably only sort of 50 to 150 years ago, I believe, that it came out of there. So it does definitely appear to be a man-made or at least partly man-made phenomenon.
Yeah, certainly man-moved, unfortunately. So even though does seem to be strains of, amphibian chytrid fungus that are not as bad, that might be more native to areas, it's sort of this global pandemic strain. So it's sort of like the killer flu or something, if you will, that has caused so much devastation.
Yeah, cool. All right. Well, look, let's move on. So many awesome chapter authors in this book that we've got. And one of them is obviously yourself with chapter 3 on the Australian wet tropics. Now, you obviously do a lot of jungling out in Southeast Asia and that kind of stuff, looking for frogs. Is the wet tropics, that's kind of always been your thing?
I did my PhD in the wet tropics. So after I finished my Bachelor of Environmental Science at the University of New South Wales, I moved up to James Cook University to work with Professor Ross Alford, who is the co-author on this chapter with me as well. So we covered that chapter together, which was really fantastic and kind of updated the scene. There's been a lot published on frog conservation and frog declines, and my PhD was focusing partly on frog declines, reasons for declines in some species versus others. So we sort of updated the picture, and it's not entirely a picture about the amphibian chytrid fungus, and certainly the whole book, there's a lot of threats facing frogs, and the amphibian chytrid fungus is just one of them. It impacts some species much more than other species as well. And together it sort of seems to be that, there's all these there's not one, really, I suppose, sort of overriding threat in one place. There's a whole lot of things together, but the wet tropics is potentially the most famous, and that's not the greatest word to use, but place in Australia for studying amphibian disease and the amphibian chytrid fungus, which I guess is why it lured me there. Really awesome frogs, but declining from really, relatively pristine places in part or even mostly due to the amphibian chytrid fungus. Yeah,
right. So that's where some of those kind of, I guess, well-known classic declines and, but as well, some of the recoveries in the 80s and 90s after chytrid kind of came through and wiped out, actually caused the extinction of several of the Tadactylus, the day frogs and the brooding frogs and things like that.
Yeah, I guess we're sort of, so far we're painting a bit of a sad picture, and certainly our frogs are in a lot of trouble. But there's also some really good news stories throughout this book. I mean, there's a lot of evidence of recoveries in frogs that have previously declined from the amphibian chytrid fungus. And there's also a lot of fantastic stories of conservation efforts working. So research that's informing frog conservation and real management things that we can do to help save frog populations. So it's not all doom and gloom.
No, absolutely not. And look, it does, as we mentioned, just cover some of the biogeography and some of the cool features of frogs in the area. For example, I did not know that the wet tropics were the most diverse region for frogs in Australia. So like, what, over 60 species or so?
Depending on how you define it. But it also has a lot of really endemic. So species that occur nowhere else, species that occur only in really small areas, and species that we're still discovering as well. It's kind of incredible. And it's also a hotspot, unfortunately, of threatened species. Most of these are the rainforest species that we're most familiar with, but even some of the sort of frogs on the edge, like the magnificent brood frog, which occurs in sort of the drier parts.
Yeah, right. Well, and look, as you mentioned, some of them are highly endemic to the area as well, and that includes one of my favorite group of frogs in Australia, the Microhylidae. Now, the Hylidae, for our listeners, did get changed to the Pelodryadidae, but before that there was another genus that was termed and is still termed the Microhylidae. So they are obviously small tree frogs. There are tiny, tiny, tiny little tree frogs. Some of them are restricted to like a handful of mountaintops in the wet tropics of Australia. Large, I think, is Cophyxalis the most speciose genus that we have. Most of them are of that genus.
Yeah, and there are 15 species of microhylids and two genera in the wet tropics. Definitely the most diverse is the Cophyxalis, and that one's thought to have really come out of the wet tropics, radiated in the wet tropics as well. And of course, these little microhylids have a lot of relatives. The family Microhylidae is much more diverse overall in other parts of the world, but we just get the microhylids sort of hitting the top of Australia as well. So they're really interesting frogs. Growing up in Sydney, you don't see a microhylid. I never knew, what they looked like, what they sounded like really until I got up to do my PhD as well. And what's sort of one of the unusual things about them, and there are a number of species in Australia that aren't so tied to water, but these little guys call away from the water. So they're not interested in the water at all. The forest is wet enough for them. And so there was a lot of times where I'd have to tell volunteers, if you get too far away from the stream and you think that you're going to head back to the stream by following the noises of frogs, you better pick the right frogs to follow, because if you pick the microhylids to follow back to the stream, they'll lead you off into the forest. You need to pick the stream breeding frogs, because the little microhylids will just call off in the forest far away from water, because they're not reliant on water for their tadpoles. They have direct development, so they just lay an egg which turns into a little frog, which makes them not the one to follow if you want to find your way back to the stream. Right,
so that direct development, is that pretty much specifically an adaptation for things in the wet tropics, or is there a lot of other frogs that managed to pull off the skipping the tadpole phase?
Around the world, there are a lot of frogs that end up doing that. Most typically, or almost always, that is in really wet places, so where the eggs don't dry out. That's the only place in Australia that, up in the north there in the rainforest, but there are other frogs that do lots of funky things that sort of avoid partially having a tadpole, or, our little brood frogs, the Pseudophrony, they will actually sort of have the eggs, lay them in moist leaf litter, and the eggs will almost kind of the larvae will kind of just pause and wait, and they can do that for a while, and they're just waiting for the rains to wash them into the little temporary creeks and rivulets. So some really cool things, and a lot of the time frogs call from places where you might not think. With FrogID, we're always telling people to that water is the best place, creek, stream, pond, but there are a lot of frogs that wouldn't be calling around there at all. And so from just temporary drainages in the lead up before the rains, you'll often get frogs just calling and breeding in the leaf litter, which is pretty cool. And in the wet tropics, you get microhylids that are just calling off in the forest.
And sending, unwary students off into the trails, never to be seen again.
Yep.
Well, look, as you mentioned as well, there has been some pretty interesting recoveries after chytrid. For example, the green-eyed tree frog, Litoria serrata, and the armoured mist frog, Litoria lorica, which I believe was thought extinct.
Yeah. So there's a couple of frogs, and a couple of them, the green-eyed tree frog and the waterfall frog, that have been, and I like to use the pun, bouncing back over the last several decades, which is really great news. And in even cases, as you say, of the rediscovery. So Litoria lorica wasn't seen for about 30 years, and it was kind of thought that it had disappeared forever, and was rediscovered in just one population on the edge of the rainforest. So potentially there was, and what the theory is, that it's sort of a bit of a refuge. So it was a slightly drier part of its range, and the amphibian chytrid fungus is, as its name implies, it's sort of a type of ancient fungus that relies on quite moist conditions. So in these slightly drier areas, it seemed that the frogs had a slight advantage and they were not, driven to local extinction, which is fantastic. So there are definitely opportunities for rediscoveries of species. We very much hope so, because it can happen. And also rediscoveries of populations that we thought were extinct as well. And actually we're hoping FrogID will help this as well, capturing the calls of things that we thought were no longer there.
Yeah, cool. Well, look, with any luck, somebody gets one of those sharp-snouted day frogs, just happens to be calling somewhere in Mount Glorious when somebody's walking around with the app. You never know. But what do you think of some of the? Obviously, there's probably some adaptation going on in some of these populations. The more resilient, more or maybe less immunocompromised frogs are surviving and then passing those genes on to the next generation or something like that. Or there might be changes in the epidemiology of chytrid fungus. As you mentioned, obviously, it seems that temperature and dryness, and I think I read that even salinity may have potential mitigating effects, or at least interact with chytrid in some fashion.
Yeah, there's so many things that we have to think about when it comes to a disease, because it's not just the pathogen, or in this case the chytrid fungus, and it's not just the host, in this case the frog, but it's the environment, the frog and the pathogen that are sort of interacting together, and changes in any one of these can have really dramatic consequences and tip the favour in terms of the pathogen, or tip it in favour of the frog. My PhD was focused largely on sort of the effects of the environment, and just how the frog's natural behaviour, whether they went up into the canopy and got really hot and dry, or whether they stayed under the rocks in the stream, was likely to have an impact on whether they declined or not. We're still understanding the reasons for frogs being able to bounce back. It's an interplay between a lot of different things, but we do think that a lot of it is just that there are frogs that are somehow a little bit better to be able to handle the disease, whether or not that's because they tend to sit in warmer places, whether or not that's because their skin bacteria or their peptides are a little bit stronger and better at fighting off the chytrid. We don't know yet, but there's a lot of research going on into that, and also into ways that we can help the frogs out. And salinity is one way for some species, particularly some work done up around Newcastle looking at green and golden bell frogs, which have been hit hard by the amphibian chytrid fungus, and looking at whether if you just put some salt in some of the ponds, and certainly not all frogs would be able to handle the salt or even ponds, but whether or not that would help them out. And it seems like it is strange. The amphibian chytrid fungus is a little bit sensitive to a lot of things, sensitive to temperature, to dryness, to salt, to other chemicals. And so there are ways that we can do things to help our frogs, whether that's sort of making the ponds a bit warmer, making sure there's not too many trees over some sections, whether it's excluding frogs that tend to come in and shed their little zoospores, which is what the sort of amphibian chytrid fungus, how that spreads. Some species are quite tolerant, and by hopping around into different ponds, they can spread the disease. So there's lots of different things that we can do. We can't get rid of it from the environment, but we can help tip the balance in favour of frogs in some cases. Yeah, right.
Well, look, that would be certainly awesome if there's anything that can be done to interfere with its virulence or its ability to spread. Now, you mentioned that there's some frogs that are moving it around and can handle it fairly well. So obviously there's some that can't. Some of them will be more tolerant than others. And I was reading that some of the less tolerant ones will be a little bit imperiled potentially by those, you might call them reservoir species of frog, that can carry the chytrid fungus without a whole lot of effect and still transfer it on to other frogs. So it kind of makes certain native frogs a bit of a threat to other species of native frog.
Yeah, it does. We're starting to realise some frogs, like the common eastern froglet and some of the Stony Creek frogs, they're, for one reason or another, their populations are persist. So whether or not the individual frogs die after they get very sick, they're able to still breed enough that their populations will stick around. And by hopping around and moving the disease, shedding the zoospores, it's just like somebody with a cold coming onto a bus and sneezing all over the place. And the more susceptible species, the ones that won't be able to handle even having the disease for a bit, aren't able to breed fast enough or successfully enough to escape population declines. they're the ones that we're be quite concerned about and potentially figure out ways to try and improve the habitat, maybe make it better for them and maybe not so good for some of the other species.
Yeah, cool. Well, look, all good reasons to, I guess, be careful of transferring chytrid while you're out there frogging and doing your FrogID and your, any other kind of, I guess, potential transfer of water from one body to another. Do you have any tips for people out there using the app looking for frogs? I mean, I know we've been over some of this before, but I mean, it's fairly simple to just wash your feet in a bit of, I think it was bleachy water or something with a bit of detergent or something like that, which will minimize the chance of transferring chytrid from one area to another.
Yeah, certainly for chytrid, but also for any other things, moving from one water body to another is not great. So certainly bleach, carefully applied to the gumboots or whatever you're wearing, or even there's a lot of other chemicals that you can use to disinfect your shoes. Just making sure that you clean and disinfect your shoes between moving from one site to another. With FrogID, though, we hope that people don't need to get their feet muddy because you'll be able to hear the frogs, even from the car in some cases, that make pretty good recordings. Yeah,
right. So, hopefully minimal impact. Just record the thing, and if you can hear it, you don't need to get in the water, and it's also less cold that way, which is nice.
Yeah, definitely. That's one of the good things. Frogs are kind of yelling at us constantly, their species, and we don't need to get into the water and disturb their habitat or the frogs. We can just passively record them and help their conservation.
Oh, good on them for doing it and making it easy for us, I suppose. Now, aside from chytrid, obviously, there's still some other things that frogs in Australia have to be concerned about. There was a fair amount of logging throughout the wet tropics. And we have currently issues with yellow crazy ant in the wet tropics as well, which is a rampant invasive and basically eats anything made out of flesh or living animal, which could be potentially quite a threat to some of those small ground and forest dwelling microhylids, I imagine. Is there any kind of future lessons from this book or things that you feel should be on the monitoring list?
Look, I think there's no overriding lesson, and I think that's one of the reasons that the book is kind of split up the way it is. Different threats in different areas, different species responding in different ways, and so this book was kind of the chance to get everything together in one place. It's a summary of what's going on and a summary of what needs to be done, some of the priorities. And we're just really hoping that it inspires research into some of the areas that we believe are really important for frog conservation across the 3 regions. And it's also a really great tool for land managers, for students, for anyone that's really into biodiversity conservation or frogs in general.
No, absolutely. I mean, it is absolutely stuffed with some amazing information from, again, not only just those different biogeographic regions throughout Australia, but also, with the 4 ancient Gondwanan species from New Zealand, and then some of the Solomon Island and all those other, slightly rarer, less common in the Pacific Islands, seeing as how frogs can't exactly swim across the oceans. But all of that is covered in this book, and amazing from start to finish. So congratulations, and thanks so much for coming on to talk about this as well. This has been first of all, I've just enjoyed having this book in my hands for the last few days. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. I enjoy chatting frogs. I also enjoy writing frogs, but chatting about frogs is really fantastic. And it's fantastic that let people know about FrogID and also about this new book. So thank you.
No worries. Look, happy to have you on anytime, particularly anytime there's new froggy stuff that you want to talk about. Obviously, we'll be keeping an eye on FrogID and the progress in the future as things progress. Is there anything in particular? Obviously, I guess we're waiting for the wet season to be over and for the dry season to be over and for the rains to start coming back to start getting a whole lot of calls in for you guys.
Well, for the northern part of Australia, it's definitely slowed down, but we're still going all right. And then the southern half of Australia where there's been some rains recently.
Oh, yeah, and you've got all those winter breeding frogs that you mentioned as well. So people still get out there, jump on frogid.net.au, download that app and get out there frogging. And for those of you guys who are interested, jump on CSIRO Publishing and any other good book outlets out there. Amazon, Booktopia, all of them. You can find the book there, Status of Conservation and Decline of Amphibians, Australia, New Zealand and Pacific Islands by Harold Heatwole and Jodi Rowley. Jodi, thanks again so much for joining us. I think we're pretty much going to have to wrap it up here, but next time you're up in Brisbane, we'd love to have you here for a sit down if you're around, and maybe even we'll get out there and do some frogging and play around with the app a little bit.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
No worries, Jodi. Have a good night. All right, everybody. That's been Jodi Rowley from the Australian Museum and author of this phenomenal new book, and also at FrogID, of course. No worries, guys. I'm going to go keep musing over this book and finish my giant slice of green velvet cake. And we'll talk to you guys soon. Cheers, guys. Bye.